This isn't just an old ritual. It's a room you've stood in. The story of the scapegoat is not simply a tale of a creature driven into the wilderness by a tribe desperate to cleanse itself of shame. It is a pattern that still unfolds behind closed doors, at dinner tables, in the subtle exchanges of families where someone is silently appointed to carry what no one else will face. Imagine the father who rages inwardly but insists on his calm exterior, the mother who swallows envy to preserve the mask of harmony, the siblings who cannot risk shattering the fragile image of normalcy. Where do all these rejected emotions go? Onto the one child who seems too much, too sensitive, too difficult. This child becomes the vessel for all that is disowned. What looks like rejection is often initiation. The scapegoat is crushed by projection, made to carry guilt and shame that never belonged to them. And yet, paradoxically, that burden opens their inner eyes. The desert of exile becomes a training ground for sight. The wound becomes the organ of perception. This is why so many who were shunned as children later display a capacity to sense what others cannot name. They were not chosen by accident. They were unconsciously appointed by the family system to be the bearer of shadow. The paradox deepens, cursed and chosen at once. The scapegoated child grows up unseen, treated not as a subject, but as an object of others' unresolved conflicts. They are told they are defective, the problem, the source of discord. But beneath that imposed identity lies the very seed of vision. Only by being unseen does one develop the hunger to truly see. Only by being misunderstood does one ignite the burning fire to understand. Their exile becomes both torment and initiation. Let us pause for a moment. If you have carried accusations that never belonged to you, if you've ever felt the sting of being misnamed, mislabeled, misunderstood, then you know this pattern. It may have shaped how you see yourself even now. And yet, within that painful role lies the possibility of awakening. Like ancient rituals where the tribe sent one animal into the wilderness, not because it was weak, but because it could hold what others could not. You may have been cast out precisely because of your capacity to bear what was unbearable. As you hear this, I invite you to interact in a simple way. Drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is there. These stories reach further when they are shared across times and places. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Carl Jung's Stories Unveiled and turn on notifications so you don't miss the unfolding of these mythic journeys. But let's return to the child in the household, sitting quietly yet carrying the weight of denied emotions. Their role is invisible but heavy, appointed bearer of the unconscious. They are exiled within their own home. Yet it is precisely there, in that silent exile, that their eyes are forced open. They begin to notice what others cannot. The tremor beneath a smile, the sorrow behind an angry outburst, the currents no one else dares to name. Their burden becomes their training. The scapegoat archetype is ancient, yet always personal. It is myth and biography intertwined. The paradox is what makes it archetypal, cursed by projections, yet chosen for sight. That paradox is where our journey begins. The wound of the scapegoat is not the end of the story. It is the threshold, the doorway into becoming something more. The empath, the one who sees. And so, with this doorway opened, we move naturally toward the question, what happens to the child who carries this exile within their own skin? The child's wound becomes the seed of sensitivity. What was forced upon them as exile, shame, or defectiveness is not erased, but transmuted into an organ of perception. Picture a small child in the corner of a crowded living room. The family chatter carries on, but this child is listening for what is not being said. They notice the tightening of a jaw, the shifting of eyes, the silences that weigh more heavily than words. They have been treated as the problem, but in truth, their nervous system has become tuned like a delicate instrument, resonating with every unspoken emotion in the room. Innocence is porous. A young ego has not yet built the walls that adulthood later constructs. That very openness makes the child vulnerable to projections, but it also becomes the source of their uncanny ability to feel what others repress. They absorb envy, frustration, grief, emotions that the family could not name. While other children are praised for being easy or independent, this one is told they are too sensitive. What appears as flaw is in fact training. The exile's very wound awakens sensitivity, and sensitivity, when integrated, matures into empathy. The misunderstood child grows into someone who can walk into a room and feel the undercurrents before a word is spoken. They can tell when anger hides despair, when laughter conceals sorrow. Their own suffering sharpened their sight. Only one who has been unseen truly knows the ache of invisibility. Only one who has been unheard develops the burning hunger to listen deeply. Thus, the empath is not simply born, they are initiated by pain. But this gift is not automatic. It requires consciousness. Without awareness, the empath is fated to repeat the scapegoat role, endlessly carrying what is not theirs. The same openness that once made them vulnerable to projection can, without discernment, make them porous to every sorrow they encounter. The difference between wound and gift lies in whether they awaken to the archetypal nature of their suffering. Do they continue to identify as the problem, or do they recognize that they were chosen, not cursed? Dreams often mirror this transformation. The psyche whispers truths that waking consciousness resists. A child might dream of being chased by a monster, only to turn and see that the creature holds a hidden treasure. Or they might dream of being cast out into the night, only to find the stars speaking in secret constellations. These are symbols of initiation. What terrifies also carries revelation. The unconscious affirms what daily life denies. The scapegoat is also the potential seer. Think of how this plays out in adulthood. The wounded child becomes the adult who sits with a friend in despair and does not flinch. They can enter the corridors of another's darkness because they themselves have walked them. They sense tremors behind masks, grief behind pride, fear beneath anger. Their wound became their sight. What crushed them became their instrument. This is why empathy, when conscious, is a profound gift. It bridges one soul to another in ways logic alone cannot. At the same time, the empath must be wary. Without boundaries, sensitivity collapses into enmeshment. They drown in the sea of others' feelings, mistaking martyrdom for compassion. They confuse empathy with self-erasure. But that danger belongs to the next stage of our story. For now, it is enough to see how exile awakens sensitivity, how misunderstanding matures into hunger for understanding, and how the wounded child carries within them the possibility of becoming a healer of sight. We began with the scapegoat's exile. Now we stand at the threshold of transformation, where pain becomes perception, and perception begins to take shape as vision. The question that arises is, how does this burden turn into a faculty of vision, capable not just of sensing pain, but of interpreting its meaning? That is the path we must follow next. The burden becomes vision. What once weighed like chains around the child's neck slowly transforms into the very lens through which they see the world. This is not a simple or linear shift. It does not happen overnight. It happens in the wilderness, in solitude, in the dark nights of the soul, where the wounded one begins to notice that within the weight of their suffering lies a strange kind of clarity. The wound, paradoxically, is both scar and telescope. Dreams often serve as the first guides. The psyche, in its symbolic language, offers images of what consciousness has not yet claimed. Someone may dream of being hunted by a terrifying figure, only to discover, upon turning around, that the figure holds a glowing jewel. Another might dream of drowning in floodwaters, only to find a vessel floating nearby, waiting to carry them. These are not idle fantasies. They are rehearsals of transformation. The unconscious whispers, "The monster hides treasure. The flood conceals a boat." What you fear most may also be the seed of vision. Vision is not mere perception. It is interpretation. To see pain is one thing. To understand its meaning is another. The scapegoat who becomes conscious begins to recognize patterns in their own suffering. They realize, "I was not defective. I was appointed." The shame they carried was projection. The guilt was not theirs. The loneliness was not proof of unworthiness, but the very crucible in which sensitivity became clarity. This recognition changes everything. In Jungian terms, this is individuation beginning to stir. The personal story reveals its archetypal dimension. What once seemed a private tragedy is seen as a universal pattern, echoing in myth and dream across centuries. The exiled child realizes they stand within an ancient script, the scapegoat as potential prophet, the rejected one as the one who sees. This archetypal recognition brings distance. Instead of drowning in personal pain, they begin to navigate it as symbolic revelation. Imagine, then, how this unfolds in daily life. An adult who once carried the projections of an entire family finds themselves strangely attuned to the undercurrents of collective life. In conversations, they hear what is not said. In workplaces, they notice dynamics that others gloss over. Their vision is not cold analysis but warm resonance, like a tuning fork vibrating to a hidden frequency. They have been trained, through pain, to notice the invisible, yet vision requires discernment. Without it, the empath risks being overwhelmed, mistaking every sorrow as their own. The flood threatens to sweep them away unless they learn to build a vessel, a boundary. This is why dreams of water are so significant. They warn of danger but also reveal the possibility of navigation. To see truly, the empath must learn to contain, to interpret without being consumed, to witness without drowning. At its best, the transformation of burden into vision becomes a gift not only for the self, but for others. The empath turned seer can name what others fear to admit. They can reveal hidden griefs, name shadows, uncover unspoken truths. Their gift is not sentimental pity, but carved clarity, born of their own descent. They do not just sympathize, they know, because they themselves have walked through the fire. But before this gift can stabilize, another danger lurks: empathy without boundaries. The sensitivity that gives sight can also lead to exhaustion, depletion, and martyrdom. This is the threshold the empath must cross. Will empathy remain a curse, or will it be cultivated into conscious vision? That is the trial awaiting us in the next stage of this journey. The empath's gift is a double-edged sword. What begins as an exquisite sensitivity to the hidden emotions of others can, without consciousness, collapse into torment. The empath feels too much, too often, too deeply. They absorb sorrows that are not their own, confusing compassion with self-erasure. This is where the paradox of gift and curse sharpens into crisis. If they do not learn boundaries, empathy becomes martyrdom. If they do, empathy becomes vision. Consider how this unfolds in everyday life. The adult who once carried their family's unspoken rage or grief now finds themselves the friend who always listens, the partner who always absorbs, the worker who always takes the blame. Their nervous system, trained to notice every subtle shift in mood, reads a room like an open book. But instead of interpreting what belongs to others and what belongs to themselves, they unconsciously take it all in. They drown in psychic floods. Compassion morphs into depletion. What was once their greatest strength becomes their undoing. The mythic images echo this danger. In dreams, empaths often find themselves swept away by tidal waves, chased by faceless crowds, or chained by invisible forces. These symbols dramatize the risk of enmeshment, the danger of living as a perpetual scapegoat, endlessly absorbing the collective shadow without consciousness. The floodwaters rise, the chains tighten, the crowd shouts guilt. Without discernment, the empath accepts these verdicts as truth. They mistake possession for love, but the unconscious also offers guidance. In some dreams, a vessel appears amidst the flood. That vessel is the boundary, the conscious ego learning to contain rather than dissolve. It is not a wall of rejection, but a sacred vessel, a container that allows the empath to sail through the waters without being submerged. To cultivate this vessel is the task of individuation. Boundaries are not cold dismissal. They are the form that preserves the gift. This is where the paradox of empathy must be understood. Empathy absorption. To feel another's pain is not to dissolve into it. True compassion requires differentiation. I can witness your sorrow without abandoning myself. I can resonate with your grief without mistaking it as my own. Boundaries are not betrayal. They are fidelity to the gift itself. They allow empathy to become sight rather than sickness. Think of the archetype of Christ, not as literal theology, but as symbol. The image of one bearing the sins of the world is etched deep into the Western unconscious. Yet the deeper meaning is not about permanent martyrdom, but transmutation. To carry shadow without being consumed. To reveal rejection as revelation. To show that suffering can be transformed into vision. This is the sacred path of the empath, but it requires consciousness and courage. Without those, the empath lives crucified endlessly, mistaking their wound for their essence. With them, the empath becomes a seer. This turning point matters not only for the individual, but for the collective. A culture too often rewards self-sacrifice while punishing discernment. The empath is praised for endless giving, even as they bleed dry. But individuation demands a different stance. To say this is not mine is not selfishness. It is sacred selfishness, the preservation of a vessel that can truly hold and interpret. To refuse endless scapegoating is to honor the gift rather than squander it. The choice, then, is stark. Either drown in empathy and repeat the scapegoat's exile, or cultivate boundaries and rise into seerhood. This is the knife edge of transformation. And so the question presses forward. What of the inner voices that still whisper shame, still accuse, still remind the empath of their supposed defectiveness? To face those voices is the next trial, the descent into the shadow within. The shadow speaks from within. Even after the empath learns to distinguish between self and other, the deepest battle remains. The voices of shame that echo inside their own psyche. These are not new voices. They are the internalized chorus of the family or society that once made them scapegoat. They accuse long after the persecutors have left the room. You are unworthy. You are too much. You are the problem. These phrases lodge themselves in the marrow of the soul, becoming indistinguishable from one's own thoughts. This is the haunting of the wounded child. The exile becomes an inner exile. The empath might sit in silence yet still feel the phantom crowd pointing fingers. The dream world mirrors this reality. Faceless judges, endless trials, rooms filled with accusers. Each voice demands guilt, though the empath cannot name the crime. Such images reveal how deeply projections embed themselves. What was once external accusation becomes internal torment. But individuation requires facing these voices directly. To wrestle with them is not to silence them by force, but to ask the essential question: whose voice are you? What shadow do you carry? What projection are you bearing? The moment the empath realizes, these words are not mine, they were placed here, the chains begin to loosen. The monster reveals itself not as truth, but as mask. Awareness burns through illusion. This is the alchemy of shame. At first, shame poisons everything it touches. It convinces the empath that they are unlovable, defective, beyond redemption. Yet examined carefully, shame dissolves into recognition. It was never theirs. It was given. It was projection. When the empath asks, "Whose shame is this?" they begin the transmutation. The lead of false guilt is refined into the gold of compassion. Not compassion that erases the self, but compassion that sees clearly the wound in others without collapsing into it. Let us ground this in a story. Imagine an adult who, from childhood, was told they were too dramatic, too emotional. Every feeling they expressed was met with criticism. Later, in adulthood, they find themselves ashamed even of their tears in private. But through analysis or reflection, they begin to ask, who first told me this? Whose discomfort was it that I carried? Slowly, they see it was a parent's fear of vulnerability, a culture's discomfort with emotion. The shame lifts. In its place comes a new faculty, the ability to sit with another's grief without recoiling, because they have faced their own. This is the paradox. What once silenced them now equips them to speak. What once chained them now strengthens their discernment. The voices of accusation remain, but the empath no longer identifies with them. They are recognized as residues of shadow, not the essence of the self. Integration, not elimination, is the task. To know these voices exist, but not to be ruled by them. The Christ archetype reappears here, not as endless sacrifice, but as transfigured suffering. The empath sees that to bear another's projection without being consumed is sacred. To carry shame into the fire of awareness and let it become compassion is the work of transformation. This is no sentimental mercy. It is forged in suffering, tested in solitude, and made clear only by direct confrontation with the inner persecutors. And yet, even as shame transforms, another threshold arises. For the empath must realize that their story is not only personal. The scapegoat is not just a family role, it is a cultural and societal archetype. Entire groups are made to carry the shadow of civilizations. Outsiders, minorities, heretics, those deemed too different, become vessels for collective guilt. The empath's story echoes outward. The next movement of our journey turns from the inner voices of shame to the broader drama of collective scapegoating. The path from scapegoat to seer crosses a decisive threshold. The recognition that what once appeared as a personal wound is, in truth, an archetypal passage. The empath begins to see their suffering as part of a mythic script repeated through centuries. This recognition changes everything. No longer merely the victim of circumstance, they step into the role of interpreter. What once silenced them now calls them to speak. In ancient rituals, the scapegoat was not selected because it was weak, but because it could hold what the tribe could not. The same pattern plays out in families. The difficult child is chosen to bear what others refuse to face. Yet when consciousness arises, the scapegoated child recognizes that they were never the guilt itself, only the vessel into which guilt was poured. This shift, from identification with shame to recognition of archetypal role, is the moment exile becomes initiation. Vision follows recognition. The empath who dares to claim their gift realizes that every wound conceals a symbol, every rejection hides a revelation. Their exile, once meaningless suffering, becomes a training ground for perception. They see what others cannot. They notice fractures in relationships, hypocrisies in institutions, undercurrents in culture. To the unawakened, these perceptions may look like oversensitivity. To the seer, they are revelations waiting to be spoken. But seerhood is not without cost. Prophets across traditions are mocked, resisted, persecuted. To reveal what has been denied threatens fragile equilibria. Families resist the one who names the hidden anger. Communities resist the voice that calls out injustice. Societies exile the ones who shine light on collective shadow. This is why the seer is so often an outsider. Vision cannot be separated from exile. To see clearly is to stand apart. Yet separation brings authority. The empath who matures into seerhood becomes a bridge between worlds. They carry what the unconscious whispers and translate it into language others can understand. They do not simply feel, they discern. They do not merely absorb, they reveal. Their compassion is not self-sacrifice but clarity, the ability to hold paradox, to feel deeply while seeing truly. A dream image illustrates this turning point. One patient dreamt she was chained to a stone, accused by countless voices. They shouted that she was guilty, unworthy. But as the dream unfolded, she realized the chains were not locked. She could remove them at any time. When she did, the crowd vanished, replaced by a vast landscape of light. The insight was clear. Captivity was sustained not by iron but by belief. The scapegoat role dissolves the moment one sees through it. This threshold is not about rejecting empathy, but about refining it. The empath must learn to ask, is this feeling mine, or does it belong to another? Such discernment preserves vision without collapse. The wound is not erased, but transfigured. What once cursed now guides. What once silenced now gives voice. The scapegoat becomes the seer not by escaping suffering, but by interpreting it. And yet, the journey is not finished. To live as seer requires integration of shadow, not only perceiving the shadows of others, but embracing one's own. Without that, vision risks becoming projection all over again. The next stage calls the empath inward once more, to face their own darkness, to integrate rather than reflect, to step into wholeness. To step into seerhood fully, the empath must embrace the last and hardest task, integration of shadow. It is not enough to discern the shadows of others, nor to call out the projections of family or society. The empath must face the mirror of their own darkness. The anger they sense in another echoes the anger buried in their own soul. The grief they detect in another's eyes reverberates with the grief they themselves silenced. Without this inner reckoning, vision remains partial, clouded by unacknowledged fragments. Integration does not mean perfection. Jung taught that the psyche seeks wholeness, not flawlessness. To be whole is to bring shadow into consciousness, not to eradicate it. For the empath, this means turning inward with the same compassion they extend to others. Too often they heal everyone else while neglecting their own wounds. They listen deeply to the sorrows of others while ignoring the cries within. The transformation requires balance, to gaze at oneself as intently as one gazes at others. This is why many empaths dream of encountering archetypal guides in their inner landscapes. An old wise figure, a luminous child, a hidden temple. These dream images reveal that the self, the totality of the psyche, is guiding them toward integration. The very unconscious that once tormented them with floods and monsters now reveals itself as healer. The descent that began in exile turns toward completion in wholeness. To live as Seer is not to live untouched by darkness, but to stand within it without being consumed. The Seer can hold both wound and vision, both exile and revelation. They can feel deeply while seeing clearly. They can embody compassion without erasure. This is the mystical completion of the journey. Not martyrdom, not numbness, but sovereignty. Such sovereignty is quiet, not boastful. It does not seek to dominate, but to illuminate. The empath who has integrated their own shadow no longer drowns in the suffering of others because they have made peace with their own. They stand in the storm without being swept away because they know the storm within. Their wound becomes their wisdom. Their exile becomes their initiation. Their burden becomes their gift. And from this place, the empath takes on a prophetic role in the collective psyche. They can see when society creates scapegoats, when the vulnerable are blamed, when outsiders are demonized. They speak truth not to condemn, but to awaken. They remind the world, this shadow is yours, this guilt is yours. It is a role both dangerous and necessary, for without such voices, humanity repeats its unconscious rituals endlessly, sacrificing the innocent to preserve illusions of purity. As the narrative winds toward its close, the essential question emerges. Will you continue to wear the chains of scapegoat, or will you dare to remove them? Will you live bound by the voices of accusation, or will you claim the freedom of vision? To live as Seer is not to escape suffering, but to see its meaning, to turn wounds into symbols, exile into initiation. And so the empath's path spirals back to where it began, with the wound. But now the wound is no longer curse. It is doorway. It is the place where pain and meaning meet, where the child once burdened discovers themselves as visionary. What was exile is now initiation. What was shame is now symbol. What was rejection is now revelation. You are not merely the scapegoat you once believed yourself to be. You are the vessel of vision. The curse you carried was never truly yours. It was projection, shadow, burden displaced. And yet, in bearing it, you discovered the depths of the human heart. You learned to see beyond masks, to listen beneath words, to feel what others deny. This sensitivity is not weakness. It is the organ of sight. Reframe the question. Do not ask, why was I rejected? Ask instead, what does this rejection reveal? The shift is subtle but revolutionary. The first question keeps you bound to shame. The second transforms shame into symbol. The first keeps you in exile. The second shows exile as initiation. This is the turning point that defines seerhood. Remember this mantra. Your wound is the doorway. Your exile is your initiation. Your sensitivity is your power. When you repeat these truths, you claim your identity not as cursed, but as chosen, not as victim, but as visionary. The scapegoat lives in the shadows of others' projections. The seer walks in the paradox of deep feeling and clear sight. So let me leave you with 3 simple declarations. I exist. I matter. I begin here. These words are not abstract affirmations. They are grounding truths. They root you in sovereignty, reminding you that your life is not determined by projections, but by the meaning you choose to embody. Now a gentle invitation. Choose one boundary in the next 24 hours that protects your gift. It need not be grand. It might be saying no where you once said yes. It might be resting when you would normally sacrifice yourself. It might be speaking a truth you usually silence. Whatever it is, let it mark the beginning of living as seer rather than scapegoat. Finally, walk between worlds. Do not escape suffering, but see its meaning. Do not hide from shadow, but illuminate it. Do not lose yourself in compassion, but embody compassion with clarity. This is the art of seerhood: to stand in paradox, to hold wound in vision, to turn rejection into revelation. The journey is not finished. It spirals endlessly. Descent followed by ascent. Shadow followed by light. Again and again you will revisit the wound. Again and again you will rise with new vision. But each time, you will stand a little stronger, see a little clearer, love a little wiser. Your story is not merely personal. It is archetypal. It echoes in myths of prophets, in dreams of treasures hidden in monsters, in rituals of exile that conceal initiation. To claim your place in this lineage is to live mythically, to know your suffering was not in vain, but was the fire that forged your sight. You are no longer merely the scapegoat. You are the seer. Walk forward with eyes open, heart steady, and vision clear.